I greet you, ladies and gentlemen, even this evening, as I prepare to cover content on literature review. Literature review is one of the most critical parts of a research project, a dissertation, or a thesis. It is a part which, if well done, it can lead to a student producing a very good term paper or a very good research paper or a very good research project or a very good dissertation, and more importantly, a very good thesis. Literature review, the way I see it, is the heart of research, because the whole motivation of the enterprise of research is to actually add to the existing literature or to contribute to the ongoing debates in the literature, to extend or to diverge from the existing literature, what we call the extant literature. So it's very imperative at the onset of our research methodology course that we understand what is meant by literature review, because it's one of the most misunderstood parts of research methodology. And I believe that what we are going to cover today will assist many of us in approaching literature review in a systematic manner, so that we produce high quality work. At the end of the day, we discover that literature review is not a haphazard activity. It's actually a systematic activity. So I want to cover the 7 steps that have been identified by many scholars as being critical to coming up with, concrete, compact, concise, and a very good literature review. The first step in literature review, in the literature review process, is that the student has to narrow their topic and select research papers or the content material, which may include textbooks, term papers, newspaper bulletins, quarterly digests of statistics, IMF reports, and all of that stuff. The student must narrow their topic. Many a times when we embark on a research, we start with this broad idea where we want to investigate a certain phenomenon. The broad idea may be electronic banking. But in electronic banking, we might be interested not just in all of electronic banking, as in cards, local cards, international cards like your Visa, your MasterCard, your Maestro. The student might say, I just want to zero in on mobile banking. Not everything in electronic banking, but just on mobile banking. And in this mobile banking, I'm interested in mobile banking of banks that operate in rural areas. That's what we mean by narrowing your focus, narrowing the topic. We don't mean to say that you actually change the research topic, but here what we mean is that at the first step, the student must consider a specific area that they want to concentrate on, so that at the onset of their research process, they are quite focused. Because what we have realized over decades as academics and also as instructors at university level is that students tend to scatter their focus. For the first 1 month or so, after writing the research proposal, it won't be really clear what the student actually intends to investigate. But it's very important at the early stage that the student, is specific with regard to the research issues that they want to investigate. The student must think about their own interests, what piques them, what touches their heart, their own interests, because the research process is a grueling process from an intellectual or academic perspective. So you can't sustain something which you are not interested in. For you to be systematic, for you to be organized, and for you to be consistent in something, you have to have an active and an identifiable interest in whatever you are pursuing. If you just pursue the interests of others, you may not be able to sustain the research process from the state of conception up to the state when you present the final report, either at a colloquium or at a viva, or when you hand over the research project or the dissertation. So it's very imperative that the budding researcher or the student talks to their professor and their lecturer or their supervisor so that they can, together they can brainstorm and, exchange ideas, ventilate ideas so that the student, the supervisee, and the lecturer, the supervisor, they are on the same page as to what the student is going to focus on. The student must decide at an early stage to actually limit the scope of whatever they are researching to a smaller topic area. Yes, the parent idea may be broad, but as the student actually embarks on the research process itself, it's very imperative that the scope becomes clearly defined, so to speak. So the student might start by developing what we call a broad research question. And this broad research question will be anchored on the broad research objective or the research aim, what we call the research aim. And then the student, will be brainstorming on on bond paper like what I have here. This is before the student actually sits on at their table to actually write something on a laptop. Because as a student, you don't download research papers, and then you start to open those research papers, and then you start to type on a laptop. When you do that, you'll be plagiarizing other people's work. So as a student, you develop a research question. You ask yourself, what is the overarching, aim of your research process? I mean, why are you embarking on your study? Why are you embarking on your research? What's the major aim of embarking on your study? So this is a question that needs to be asked. Out of this question comes what we call the specific research questions or the specific research objectives. And then the second step, after defining and narrowing the focus of the study, the student has to search for literature. It's very imperative that the student searches for the literature. So once a specific area has been delineated or has been delimited by the student, it becomes easy for the students to define the source of their material in terms of research articles that have been published with a specific date range. As a rule of thumb, in our department, the Department of Banking, we normally encourage students to anchor most of their literature review, say 80% of their literature review, on literature which is 5 years or younger. It can be 6 years old, like literature which was published in 2016 up to 2022, because right now we're at the beginning of 2022. Anything which was published in 2016 up to 2022, it can anchor, it can form the, the primary foundation of whatever is being reviewed. The only exception, because every rule is an exception, but as we know, the exception must not be the rule. Every rule is an exception, but again, the caveat is that the exception must not be the rule. So we know that to this general rule of thumb, that the student's work must be anchored on literature which is 5 years or younger, or 5 years or more recent, or 5 years or more contemporary. The caveat is that where theories form the bedrock of the research topic, say theories which were propounded in the 1950s or in the 1940s or in the 1960s or in the 1970s or in the 1980s or in the 1990s or in the early 2000s or in early 2000s, from 2010 up to date, the student can cite that literature because it impinges on their research topic. It touches on the theory which underpins their research topic. That's the exception. But besides that, now the student is actually encouraged to cite or to look for specific literature, which is within a certain, date range, a specific date range. Unless if the student is a historian and they're investigating something which occurred a long time ago in the past, you may discover that most of whatever they will be writing on a specific theme will be based on old literature, say archival research. But in finance and banking and economics, things are always changing because of technology. So we don't encourage students to base their research on archaic literature, what we call archaic or very old literature. So just as a rule of thumb, ladies and gentlemen, you are encouraged to base your literature review when you are doing your literature search, to base your literature review on literature which is 5 years or younger. The exception being that when you are reviewing a concept which was propounded by someone, or a long time ago, longer than 5 years into the past, then it can be an exception. You can still review that literature and other related literature, but that old literature must not form the bulk of your literature review. That's the rule of thumb. And then to do the literature search, once the student has defined their broad aim, so to speak, or their broad objective, so to speak, it becomes very easy to locate the literature by using keywords. Once the student has brainstormed and on their bond paper or on their bond sheets, they have written the key ideas that are linked to their research topic. Then from those key ideas, they can do a search on Google or other search engine. It might be scholarly, websites, like Elsevier and so on. The student can then do a specific search using keywords that are captured in the research topic or in the broad, research objective or in the research aim. This will enable the student to locate a library, database, and which is relevant to their research. And then reference lists of recent articles and the reviews of those articles will then assist the student to isolate the literature which is relevant to their literature review process. And then the third stage, ladies and gentlemen, is that the student must actually read the selected articles thoroughly and evaluate them. The student must not download these research papers, print these research papers, and then spread them on a table and start to type and pretend they are producing a literature review. No, that's not literature review. It's just an attempt to do a sophisticated form of plagiarism. What is required of the student, once you've isolated the literature and you have downloaded your research articles or your research papers, or whatever material is relevant to your research topic, the student must move on to the third stage of actually reading. That's the most grueling or the most difficult part of literature review. The most difficult part of literature review is not writing the literature review chapter or chapters themselves, but it's actually reading. That's the toughest part of being a researcher, to actually give yourself time to read each and every article. The good thing with modern research is that there are abstracts or introductions to most research articles or research papers. So from reading the abstract, you can decide which areas of a research paper you actually need to read. Some research papers are very long. It may not be practical for you to take 2 days just reading one research paper. You may just isolate the topical issues that you're interested in. You read those issues, you make notes on those issues, you move on to another research paper. And the best technique, ladies and gentlemen, in doing a thorough literature review is to first of all isolate brief papers or shorter research papers that cover the broader scope of your research problem or your main research question or your main research objective. When you do that, you'll be giving yourself an intellectual feel of the topic in its entirety. Now, when you understand your research topic and you have immersed yourself in these short papers, maybe 1 to 20 pages long, not papers which are more than 20 pages, which are now going up to 30 or 40 pages, you may become discouraged. You'll discover that these longer papers, they tend to be very rigorous and they tend to dissect a lot of minute issues which may not be relevant to your research. Whilst the shorter research papers, they tend to summarize concepts, thereby giving you an easy feel of your research topic within a short space of time. If you are using public transport, going to work, maybe it's a train, or it's a combi, or it's a Honda Fit, or you take turns to drive each other home with your wife or with your husband, you may be reading some of these shorter research papers. By the time you arrive home, if it is a long journey from work or from your shop for you to reach home, by then you would have read almost all of the research paper, and you'll be in a position to make notes as you arrive home. So the best technique, in my view, is to isolate fairly shorter papers. Have 20 of them, either printed or somewhere in a folder in your laptop. You start to read those research papers, making notes, and then you end with the longer ones. Some people, they prefer to look for a comprehensive paper on a topic which is related to their topic. They read that comprehensive paper and then followed by some shorter papers. It depends on what you prefer, but here I was just suggesting something which can help you to understand the main areas of whatever you are researching. In my view, the best technique is to have as many papers from various authors as possible, which are tackling different aspects of your research topic, so that by the time you finish your reading of literature and the making of notes after the reading of your literature, you'll be knowing the fundamental assumptions that underpin your research area. You'll be knowing the methodologies and the testing procedures, as well as the subjects, the research subjects, and the materials that have been tested by other researchers. And you'll be knowing the experts in the field. You'll be having a feel of the experts of that particular research area that you have decided to target. And you'll be knowing the entire spectrum of views which prevail in the research area that you have isolated or that you have chosen. You'll be knowing, for instance, which theories conflict with which theories, because in any broad research area, you'll find that there are scholars who will be believing, things which are actually opposite of each other in explaining a phenomenon. I can give an example in economics. In economics, we have got, Keynesians and classicalists or monetarists, for instance. You have got modern Keynesians and you have got modern classicalists or new classicalists. These are two extremes. Once you read your literature, say in money and banking or in independence of the central bank, you will find these strands of thought, Keynesianism and classicalism. So you'll be able to master the scholars that are protagonists on either side of the divide when it comes to conflicting theories, and also the research methodologies that are popular in a particular research area. You will be knowing them. And then the fourth stage in your literature review process is to organize the selected research papers by looking for patterns and developing subtopics. Now, at this stage, at the fourth stage, that's when you start to write your literature review. All along, you are just doing a literature search, sifting through the research papers to come up with ideas. At stage number 4, that's when you start in earnest to write your literature review by organizing the selected research papers, by looking for patterns. You start to discover patterns in the literature, and then you develop subtopics out of that. And then there are points that you need to note when you are reading the different literatures or the different research papers. You must note the findings which are common, which recur in almost all of the research papers in a particular broad research area, and the findings which are contested. What are the gray areas in the area in which you are researching? What are the points of convergence in terms of findings? And then the next thing which you need to note are the important trends in the research. Which schools of thought trend virtually in all of the papers or in most of the papers? And then the other thing that you need to observe is the most influential theories in the area that you would have chosen. A key point to note is that if your literature review is extensive, you must find a large table surface, and only it you must paste all the notes, a large table surface, and then you post notes or small cards or small pieces of bond paper where you will be writing, some notes in order to organize the findings. And then it's always instructive to organize the findings through a table or through tables, depending on the trends and the patterns that recur in the different literatures. And then from there, before you finish the fourth stage, you can then develop subheadings. That's what then instructs your literature review chapter itself. And then the fifth part of the literature review process is to develop a purpose statement. So the student has to write a sentence or two, or even 3 sentences, to summarize the conclusion that they would have reached about the major trends and developments in the research area that they are investigating. And then the sixth aspect, the other areas I'm going to explore them in a subsequent lecture. The sixth aspect or stage is to write the research paper. So the student will now follow the organizational structure that has been developed in stages 4 and 5 to produce, a systematic work which has got headings and subheadings. Under headings and subheadings, the student will start to populate with content in a logical and in a systematic manner, in such a way that, the different sections, headings and subheadings, they interlock. And then the final stage, ladies and gentlemen, in the literature review process is to review one's work. Once a draft of the literature review has been completed, the student must look at the topic sentences of each paragraph. They must read these topic sentences, organize the grammar, sort out the grammar and the keywords in the topic sentences of each and every paragraph, see whether the topic sentences of each and every paragraph, they speak to one another, and in turn, they speak to common trends and, important themes of the literature which is being reviewed by the student. So that's the brief on the steps that the student needs to take into account when they are doing their literature review. And then there are so many types of literature review. I'm going to just mention them in passing to tease you for a subsequent lecture that I'm going to do tomorrow on the different types of literature review. Because students, my experience has been that students, they just approach literature review like it's something which you do out of inspiration or by trial and error. But literature review has got many different types. The first type, I can start by defining literature review itself. The term literature review is a generic term which refers to a critical examination, analysis or evaluation of published materials in the extant literature or in the current literature. It normally covers a wide range of subjects at various levels of completeness or comprehensiveness and intellectual rigor. It may or may not include research findings, because literature review can be the review of literature which has got no findings. Literature term papers where a researcher or an author was just reviewing the work of others, or where they were just interrogating a certain phenomenon without gathering data to validate their ideas. Such articles, they are also included in literature review. So that's the brief working definition of literature review. And then we have got a critical review. The aim of a critical review is to demonstrate that the writer has extensively researched the literature and critically evaluated its quality. So the student goes beyond mere description to include a degree of analysis and conceptual innovation or evaluation to demonstrate that they understand the most important hypotheses and models that underpin a particular research area. So that's a critical review. You can just see or hear from the definition, the working definition that I've just given you of a critical review, that it's something which is far much deeper than merely reading and literature for the purposes of describing the trends and the patterns that prevail in the literature. And then there is a systematic map or the mapping review. This is to map out and categorize existing literature, like what I was describing in the research process in stage number 3 and stage number 4. You map out and categorize existing literature from which to commission further reviews and or primary research by identifying gaps in the literature review. So the aim of this kind of literature review is to identify knowledge gaps. And then there is meta-analysis. It's a term which is very prevalent when it comes to social media activity, meta-analysis. This is a technique that statistically combines the results of quantitative studies to provide a more precise effect of the results. So meta-analysis has got a lot to do with statistics. It deriving trends from the statistics that are associated with either a process or a particular phenomenon which is being studied. And then there are mixed studies review or mixed methods review. This refers to any combination of methods where one significant component of a literature review, say systematic literature review, is combined with other methods of reviewing literature. Within a review context, it refers to a combination of review approaches which combine, for instance, quantitative and qualitative research, which may also combine outcome with process studies, as in the sciences, or in those research with those disciplines where there is a lot of experimental, research designs that are used. And then the other type of literature review is the overview. This again is the generic term which refers to the summary of the literature that attempts to survey the literature and describe its characteristics. There are papers that are like that, which do overview research. They cover basically all the components that touch a particular research area or a broad research area. And then there is a qualitative systematic review or evidence synthesis. This particular method of reviewing the literature involves integrating or comparing the findings from qualitative studies. It looks at themes or constructs that lie in or across individual qualitative studies. Say someone is investigating on internet banking or electronic banking. they zero in on those qualitative studies that have investigated that particular phenomenon. And then from those qualitative studies, the method integrates or compares the findings of different qualitative studies. And then there is the rapid review. This is assessment of what is already known about a policy, practice, legislation, issue, or phenomenon or process. By using a systematic review approach or systematic review methods or techniques to search and critically appraise existing literature. And then there is the scoping review or survey. This is the preliminary assessment of the potential size and scope of the available research literature. It aims to identify the nature and the extent of research evidence, which includes research which is still ongoing. And then we also have the state-of-the-art review, which tends to address more current matters in contrast to other combined retrospective and current approaches. It may offer new perspectives on a particular issue process and point out an area which requires further investigation or examination on something which is topical or prevalent. And then we've got the systematic review, which I've been mentioning in previous definition. This systematic review seeks to systematically or step by step search for, appraise, and synthesize research evidence by often sticking to guidelines as to the conduct of a review. And then there is the systematic search and review. This combines strengths of critical review with a comprehensive search process. It typically addresses the broad questions that impinge on a research topic. And then there is the umbrella view, ladies and gentlemen. As the term indicates, this specifically refers to reviewing a body of evidence from many sources or multiple sources or reviews into one accessible and usable document so that it can instruct the student on the way forward, either in terms of research methodology or a further investigation or a more critical analysis of the literature. I believe today, at this juncture, we've covered what we needed to cover as an introduction of our study of literature review as part of our research methodology course. Thank you so much for listening in. Have a good evening.